This isn't going away. We will be out of this pandemic, but this will become what we call an endemic risk.
Right now, on The New Normal, News 12 is bringing you a one-on-one interview with the man who helped write the playbook for pandemics.
New York City was on the brink of collapse. Their healthcare system was breached.
Tonight, we speak with former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb about where we're headed in this pandemic. Plus, we'll clear up some of the confusion surrounding booster shots. And the clock is ticking for thousands of New Yorkers facing vaccine mandates. The New Normal starts now. This is The New Normal. I'm Rich Barrabi. Thank you for joining us. Just hours ago, new developments taking place in the effort to stop the spread of COVID-19. Pfizer submitting its first round of data for a COVID-19 vaccine for children under the age of 11. The dose, just a third of what's given to adults. It comes as certain tri-state area regions are seeing an uptick in pediatric cases of COVID-19. In New York, Long Island currently has the second highest number of COVID-19 cases among students for any region outside of New York City. The medical director of Cohen Children's Medical Center says vaccinations are vital to turning the tide of the pandemic.
My message to parents that once their children are eligible for vaccination, to please get them vaccinated.
Okay, so what's next? Well, Pfizer plans to file a formal request for emergency use of its COVID-19 vaccine in younger children in the coming weeks. So tonight, we're asking you, how concerned are you about the rising number of COVID cases in children? Take a look at the results we have for you right now on our News 12 poll. You see almost 40% of you say very concerned. Just about 22% say somewhat concerned. Not concerned at all? Over 38%. What do you think? This poll is live right now on the News 12 Twitter page. Let us know what you think. You can also leave us a comment. You see we're scrolling through some of those. We're going to continue to do that throughout this show. We're going to cycle through all of the comments that you sent to us today. Joining us now on The New Normal is the former FDA Commissioner, Dr. Scott Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb is also a member of Pfizer's board of directors. Doctor, good to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
So, Commissioner, how concerning is it to you, the rise in COVID-19 cases among children? You know, there was so much talk about early in the pandemic, at least the kids don't get it. Well, clearly that's no longer the case.
Look, with this Delta variant, I think it's going to be hard to control outbreaks in schools, and that's why I think the prudent thing to do is to go into the school year with precautions in place, because we don't really understand what the dynamic's going to be and the difficulty that we're going to have with this much more contagious variant in that setting. And so that means using masks in schools, implementing routine testing. A lot of schools aren't making use of routine testing, where we could be testing students once a week or twice a week ideally. Keeping kids in defined social pods, so not letting large groups of kids intermingle, but trying to keep them in geographic social pods so that if there is an introduction into the school setting, it doesn't infect the entire schoolhouse. Maybe the class is exposed, but not a whole grade. Those are some of the prudent precautions that we know work in that setting. I think across the country, as you look across the country, a lot of states aren't implementing those kinds of precautions, and the consequence is that you're seeing very large outbreaks in the schools, particularly in the South. There's this sort of perception that COVID isn't as serious in children, and that's certainly the case in terms of not seeing the extreme death and disease in kids that we're seeing in older individuals, thankfully. But, you know, this coronavirus is still a dangerous pathogen, and we don't know all the long-term consequences. And I think we want to do everything we can to prevent large outbreaks in school settings and mass infecting America's population of kids. And so this is going to be a difficult virus to control in the schools. We've seen the South struggle with that, and hopefully we can do a better job here in the Northeast.
Okay, so to that end, we mentioned that you're a current member of the Pfizer board. Can you tell us a little bit more about today's developments regarding the vaccine for those under the age of 11, if and when we could see emergency authorization for those shots? What do you think?
Right. Pfizer announced today that they started a rolling submission to the FDA. They submitted the clinical data associated with that application. You know, it depends on how long the FDA takes to review this package, and ultimately if the FDA believes that the data, the package supports the authorization of the vaccine. But I think in a best case scenario, you know, this would probably be a 4-week review by the agency. You might have an authorization by the end of October. If it slips a little bit, it probably will be more like mid-November. But things are on track. You know, the clinical trial itself showed good data in terms of the immune response from the vaccine. This is a vaccine, as you said at the outset, that's 1/3 the dose used in adults. So it's basically the same vaccine that's being used in older individuals, but in a lower dose. Pfizer actually tested 3 different doses. They tested the same dose that they're using in adults, a 30 microgram dose. They tested a 20 microgram dose, and then they tested a 10 microgram dose and made the decision to take forward the 10 microgram dose because it seemed to produce a comparable level of antibodies as the adult dose did in adults. But being a lower dose formulation, the presumption is you're going to get less vaccine-related side effects, so less headaches, less fatigue, less sore arms, because those immediate side effects from the vaccine are often dose-related, and to the extent that you can use a lower dose, the belief is that you'll have a more tolerable vaccine. And in young kids, that's very important. You don't want to have a vaccine that's going to cause a lot of vaccine-related side effects like fever and arm pain. You want to have a vaccine that's going to be very tolerable in the young kids.
Okay, so let's say the emergency use authorization is granted. Then you have to win over the hearts and minds of parents who are going to actually come forward and say, yes, I will allow my child to get the vaccine. That can be more difficult than just asking everyday Americans to get the shot themselves. So how does Pfizer and how does the federal government, local governments go about doing that?
Well, look, I think it's going to take a lot of work of pediatricians as well. Parents are going to seek out advice from pediatricians, and they're going to have to counsel parents on this decision. Anytime you put a medical product in an otherwise healthy child, that's a difficult decision on the part of a parent, and I understand that. I think that the imperative is to vaccinate kids. I think that the risk-benefit overwhelmingly favors vaccinating children, but parents need to consult their doctors and have that conversation with them. We've seen in the older kids, where the vaccines are now available, 12 and above, about 50% of eligible children have been vaccinated around the country. So there is pretty good uptake, less than what we're seeing in the adult population, but there has been uptake. I would guess that parents with younger kids are going to be a little bit more tentative, so you may not see as rapid uptake. Eventually, this vaccine is going to probably be incorporated into the childhood immunization schedule. I wouldn't expect that to happen this year. That's more like a fall 2021, 2022 event. But once you have multiple approved vaccines for kids, eventually the CDC is going to convene to make a consideration about whether or not this vaccine gets incorporated into the childhood immunization schedule, like other vaccines are mandated as a requirement for attendance in schools.
Okay, let's talk about adults now, and specifically about boosters. We've seen the CDC, the FDA issue different guidance. That's on top of President Biden's initial calls for boosters for the general public. Do you think all of that mixed messaging may have hurt the effort to convince those who are unvaccinated to even get a first shot?
Yeah, well, look, I don't think it was mixed messaging. I think it was the application of a process that really wasn't suited for responding to a crisis. And I talk about this a lot in the new book I have out. We took a process that was designed for making deliberations about what should go in the pediatric immunization schedule. So the CDC advisory committee that ultimately weighed in is an advisory committee that has a lot of responsibilities, but its primary responsibility is to make decisions about what vaccines would go in the childhood immunization schedule. And so what you have is you have FDA rendering a judgment about vaccines based on an assessment of their safety and effectiveness on who should have a vaccine available to them. And in the process creates a second step where then the CDC's advisory committee weighs in on eligibility. So you basically have two regulatory decisions weighing in on the same decision against a different set of criteria. And the reason why we do that in normal times is because we want that process to be highly deliberative, we want it to be carefully considered, and frankly, we want it to be slow, because decisions about putting a vaccine in a childhood immunization schedule and mandating it is a weighty decision. You want to make sure you get it right. And so you have a very deliberative process to make those decisions. But in the setting of a fast-moving public health crisis, when you're dealing with an adult vaccine, that's optional, where adults have discretion on whether or not they take the vaccine, where you want to move quickly, and you want to move with a unified front because you don't want to create a perception that there's any kind of disagreement between public health authorities that you know is going to be exploited by people who want to sow discord and discontent and doubt about the vaccine. That process may not be the best process for making these decisions. So I think from the outset we should have thought about trying to create a different process and brought those two regulatory agencies together in a more seamless fashion, allowed FDA and CDC to work together closely from the outset, so you didn't have this sort of sequential, disjointed process, but you had one seamless process. And that's, in fact, what the Israelis did. They did not put this decision through their normal regulatory process. They created a different process that was carefully tailored to the crisis that they were facing.
So, Doctor, all of that's taking place against the backdrop of the Delta variant. When could we potentially see the end of this surge? Are we looking at the holidays here?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what we see in the Northeast. I think that there is a presumption. So we've seen this Delta variant become epidemic in different parts of the country. It's been regionalized. And this epidemic, the whole pandemic's been highly regionalized. There's really only been one point in time when we had a confluent epidemic across the whole U.S., and that was last winter. Otherwise, these surges have been on a regionalized basis, and they've spread across the country in sort of a sequential fashion. We saw a very dense surge of infection in the South with this Delta variant. We're now seeing the Midwest light up and the Pacific Northwest. Right. I think there's a presumption that the Northeast is somewhat impervious because of the high rates of vaccination and prior infection. I don't believe that's the case. I think we're going to see an uptick in Delta cases. But on the back end of this Delta surge, hopefully prevalence declines. I believe it will. And that could be around Thanksgiving when you start to see case levels really start to come down and prevalence start to level off.
All right, very good. Former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb, stay right there, because when we return on The New Normal, we're going to talk about Dr. Gottlieb's new book. You see it right there, Uncontrolled Spread. We're going to dig more into that right after this, right here on The New Normal.